Welcome to the Nourish Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nourish Child Podcast. I'm so excited to introduce Maya Feller to you today. She is the founder and lead dietitian at Maya Feller Nutrition and a cookbook author. And we are going to be talking about her brand new cookbook, as well as a lot of other things, but Eating from Our Roots, 80 plus healthy home cooked favorites from cultures around the world. The theme of this podcast is going to be cultural foods and how to help your children get introduced to them. And Maya is the expert in helping us learn all about that. So welcome to the show, Maya.
Oh, Jill, thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here.
It's great to have you here. I feel like we just saw each other, which we did. But I know that your book just came out at the end of January, and I'm sure you are on just like that high of getting it out there, talking about it, promoting it, all of those good things. But before we get to the book, and we will, tell everybody about you and how you got into this wonderful world of nutrition.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny story. And as I look back and think about it, it gets funnier because Jill, my undergrad was in experimental theater and philosophy, two things that have not much to do with clinical nutrition, community nutrition, and also don't have much to do with science. Like, I satisfied my science classes by taking sociology and, no organic chemistry ever in my undergrad. So it's funny that I ended up in this very clinical field. I got here actually after completing my experimental theater and realizing that there was no possible way for me to be a fully functional human being in New York City. There was no grocery purchasing as an experimental theater artist. And I was like, what am I going to do? And I was training for the Boston Marathon, and
Yay, Boston!
Yes. So I'm from Massachusetts. And I was running for a charity, and my running partner kept ending up in and out of the hospital.
Oh, wow.
And because we were not doing a very good job of nourishing ourselves or properly hydrating ourselves. So she had hyponatremia and then hypernatremia. So for people who don't know, basically her electrolyte balance was so off that she was either severely dehydrated or overhydrated.
Oh, wow.
And so, Jill, I literally Googled nutrition for runners. And then I was like, oh my goodness, this is a whole thing. I was like, we have been doing a really bad job. And that's where I actually can use the word bad. We were not doing a very good job. We were young.
Yeah.
And so, I thought, oh, maybe I'll study this. And because it was fascinating. And I actually applied to the one university that said it was okay for you to have no science background. Because remember, I'm coming from experimental theater and philosophy. And then I had to I had a whole year and a half of all science credits.
Wow.
So that I could actually then apply to become a dietitian. And once I was in, I was in love with the science of nutrition, metabolism, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. You know what I mean? All of the medical nutrition therapy, the pediatric nutrition. I mean, I was in pure nutrition bliss.
Yeah.
And it was I say running brought me to it.
Yeah. It's, that's great. I have a daughter right now training for, I think, a half marathon. I forget where she's having it, maybe Long Island. And they are, and she was raised by a dietitian, but she is doing what you did, which is really digging into what she needs to do to fuel properly, hydrate, all that stuff. So it's kind of fun to hear that. And I always love to get into the origin story because we all have a different one. There's always this common thread of the terrors of biochemistry I think we all hate that part of it. I don't know. Maybe there's some dietitians out there that love that part of it, but that's the part that kind of weeds us out. So tell everybody what you do day to day. Like, what does your day look like?
So it's interesting because I have a private practice and we're a small team, and we toggle between seeing people in person, but then also virtual sessions. And we work with mostly people who have some type of diagnosis, right? So there is some reason for them clinically and medically to see a dietitian. And our focus is really looking at patients, working with them from this anti-bias lens. So if we're working with a family and we're, focused on nutrition for the kid, we are allowing the family to be the experts in their lived experience and tell us kind of what's going on, right? I can look at someone's lab work and come to my own conclusions, but Jill, I may not know why their lab work is that way. It's just lab work. So you always need the person.
Right.
So that's a big part of how we work in my practice. And then when I'm not seeing patients, the other part of what I do is media and communications, right? So it's sometimes, on air, talking to the nation. Maybe it's writing an article, very similar to your work, right? And my focus there also is to make sure that I'm thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, so that I can really talk about food from a very neutral perspective and a perspective that is not inherently biased and one that does not harm the person, hopefully, who's reading or listening to my words, and one that is not steeped in kind of shame or judgment.
Okay. Let's unpack that a little bit, because I'm not curious for myself, but I'm curious for my listeners. I want them to understand what you mean by coming from a place that's bias sensitive.
Yeah. So nutrition is complicated. It's complicated in that you've got people who are the professionals and credentialed, and then you have people who are not. However, we all eat.
Yes.
We all have varying needs in terms of how we should nourish our bodies. We all have different genetic makeups, so our body responds differently to food, external stresses, and stimuli. However, there's all of this dominant messaging around how you're meant to eat, what you're supposed to eat. If you don't engage in a particular type of eating, then there's a morality that's attached to your behavior. And then in the ether, you are told you're no good because you didn't eat the way that dominant culture says is the right way to eat. And because there's all of that implicit bias in food, i.e., lettuce is better than a slice of white bread, right? There's bias there. That means that someone can walk into a dietitian's office or a doctor's office, and the first thing that they will hear, regardless of what they're there for, is either you should lose weight, if that's what the provider believes, or you should try to eat healthy, if that's what the provider believes. Those statements, as standalone statements, are steeped in bias because A, weight may or may not be meaningful in relation to why the person is there. In fact, it's most often not. And eating healthy really means something different for everyone. And you also have this provider who is actually deciding what's important for the person that's come to them. So the way that we talk about implicit bias in my work, in my practice, is that it's something that we like just pick up from the air, and then we go ahead and we perpetuate it. So I really try when I'm working with patients and when I'm writing to make sure that I'm coming from a neutral perspective when I'm thinking and talking about food, nutrition, nourishment, access to food, preparing food, so that I'm not perpetuating harm or making someone feel bad about their choices.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for breaking that down for listeners. And that really does then tie into this whole idea of food shaming. Let's unpack that, if you will.
Yeah, so food shaming is really prevalent. Sometimes I like to explain it like you're at a family gathering and you put your plate together, and then there's a comment about either how much or how little is on your plate. Do you intend to eat all of that in relation to however you look at the moment? Here's a perfect example. We were at a family gathering, and my youngest happens to be very, very slender. And the first thing that someone said to her is, wow, you're so skinny. Look at that. And then they turned to me, does she eat?
Oh, geez. Yeah.
Right. That, that is like really shameful for the person who's experiencing that. And my daughter often, many nights before she goes to bed, says to me, will I grow? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Will I ever be bigger? Will my legs be bigger? And I say to her, your body's going to do what it needs to do, right? And it's going to get you to where you need to be. And what's most important is that you're healthy and that you can play and run and jump and learn.
Yeah.
Right. And that I'm not also assigning a good, bad, or you are perfect as you are. Yeah. Really, because I'm trying to diffuse the language while validating the experience that she feels terrible about being so slender. Sure. And then on the other side, there are people who are in larger bodies who feel a huge amount of shame because we actually value thinness, right? And then they are often kind of come up against people who feel like they can say anything. So not just family members, not at gatherings, but out in the street, right? In public spaces. Where people feel like they can comment on what they're eating. And this goes for both children and adults.
Yes. Yeah. And so what you're describing, when you said lettuce is better than white bread, that's food shaming. And you described fat shaming that happens to people in larger bodies, and skinny shaming that happens to individuals in smaller bodies. So all the shaming is based in bias and is no bueno. So for anybody out there listening, this is not good stuff. And we all need to be more conscious and aware and cognizant of our words and actions. So as we talk about, I want to talk about cultural foods, heritage foods. I don't know, what's the best terminology to talk about foods from other cultures, other countries, other patterns of eating? What's the best language to talk about that? And how does that tie into food shaming?
So there are many different ways to talk about foods that are culturally relevant for a person. When it's a culture that is not our own, right, then that we can say that, that's not food from my culture. But when we're talking about individuals, I usually say food that is culturally relevant. And I also like to remind people that everyone has culture, right? I was born and raised in the U.S., and there's definitely a culture around quote unquote American food. Mm-hmm. And then that breaks down according to race and ethnicity sometimes, right? But it's also can break down by region. And what I like to say, well, first I should go back and say, race is a social construct. So it's something that was constructed. And Black food in the Northeast is totally different than quote unquote Black food in the center of the country, just as the food that people who are white Americans eat, on the West Coast of the US is very different than the food that white Americans eat in Texas. Gotcha. So there are cultural nuances within groups. There's a plethora of variety as you move around the globe. And what I found in my research is that there are flavors, tastes, and preparation techniques that are similar. However, they change when you go from home to home, and also change when people migrate from one place and then try to replicate that dish in a new place and have to use whatever's around them.
Mm.
So there is a lot of language around how we talk about cultural foods because it can vary. Like I often use the example of being with friends, and one friend who's Austrian and Finnish, we were having dinner together, and one of the dinner guests said, "Oh, the food from the indigenous people in the mountains of Obertauern." And I said, "Yeah, exactly." And that's Austria. That's like the Alps in Austria. It's just that we don't often hear that conversation in relation to European or white American people. We often talk about indigenous people in relation to people who are assigned to racial and ethnic minority groups. So I say that there's a lot of nuance because everybody has culture. And then there are places that people come from where they are indigenous too.
Gotcha.
I think I answered the question.
No, that's good. So when we talk about, the foods that are of your culture or relevant to your culture, how does food shaming show up, particularly in the United States? So we're talking to, US parents here. I know my podcast is global, but not really. It's really parents in the US. So how does sort of these cultural foods tie into food shaming? Like, I know there are kids growing up in the United States that are not eating their cultural foods because they feel shame.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that I have to do is frame the conversation in most of our recommendations from like the overriding health authorities are coming from a very particular white American wellness lens.
Yes.
If we look at my plate, the recommendations are half your plate as a non-starchy vegetable, a quarter as a lean protein, and a quarter as a starch.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is that many people do not eat their plates in that way. Mm. Combination foods are very hard to wrap our head around. Things like lasagna or a stuffed pepper, right? Or eggplant parmesan. Like, how does that fit into that recommendation? Because the recommendation is held up as the gold standard, that means implicitly, right? Every other food that can't fit into that maybe shouldn't be eaten. And that's from the implicit bias perspective.
Kids change a lot. Their nutrition needs, eating habits, and food preferences do too. So much so, it can be hard to keep up. The Nourished Child, a website designed for parents who want more nutrition education, helps parents like you get crystal clear on raising good eaters. We've cracked the code on nourishing the whole child, whether you're raising a baby, a teen, or a child with health concerns. Our nutrition school and parent education programs help you get the inside scoop on food and nutrients, positive food parenting, and building self-motivated, autonomous kids who are good eaters. Visit thenourishedchild.com today.
So when we talk about food shaming, what I'm saying is we have to shift the gold standard and the recommendations that we're making, because curried chickpeas and, stewed spinach or cabbage and some type of, maybe chicken or fish or turkey in your stewed vegetables, that's an amazing meal right there. Mm-hmm. Doesn't necessarily fit my plate, right? Mm-hmm. And could be applicable to Southeast Asian cuisine, Afro-Caribbean cuisine, Afro-Latino cuisine, right? And what I've seen from my patients is that because there are no representations of the foods from wherever they are. And when I say my patients, I have patients who are from Poland. I have patients who are from Thailand, and they've all migrated to the US. I have patients who identify as Mexican American. They don't see their foods. Yeah. And so then they feel like, wait a second, is my food heart healthy? Is my food something that I can eat if I have diabetes? Is it my fault when I eat these foods if I then get a diagnosis? When I like to remind everyone that actually the majority of people living in this country don't actually meet the recommendations for fruit and vegetable intake, regardless of where they're from. right? So it's complicated. There's contradictions, there's nuance, but the shame is overarching because the gold standards don't have space for variety, especially when it comes to cultural foods.
Yes. And so experiencing shame around that probably, I'm assuming, makes people step away from those foods, put them in the background, avoid them even perhaps. And that causes or potentially causes um, generations below them to not appreciate, engage, or experience those foods. Is that right?
Yeah, so that is right. And then the other thing that happens is that they don't also eat the quote unquote recommended foods either. Right.
Yeah.
So it's not only have they stepped away from their cultural foods that are inherently healthy, right? Like I think about, this one patient that I had from Thailand who wanted to have this incredible soup for breakfast, but felt like soup wasn't something that you could have for breakfast because they never saw it in the US as marketed as a breakfast food. So they stopped eating it. But then they weren't eating breakfast at all because they were like, I don't want, whatever is the conventional breakfast here. And so I've seen that with so many of my patients. They just step away from food and then they end up in this place where they're so unsure about what the right thing to eat is that they fall into these spaces of not actually nourishing themselves.
Yeah. So what do we do? What do we need to do differently? What do, parents who are out there listening who might have a very rich cultural heritage with food and who may find themselves substituting peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for something more culturally relevant? What do you have to say to those parents or those families?
So I often say to my patients, especially the ones who have kids, that first of all, I see you and I know it's really hard, right? It's like peanut butter and jelly is socially acceptable. Coming in with something that has a strong, smell or different look can be really hard for kids, right?
Yeah.
And as a parent and dietitian, I understand that. Even my daughter is like, Mom, stop sending me with like the strange snacks. And I'm like, what strange snacks? And I was like, I sent you with stone ground corn tortilla chips. I'm like, that's not strange. But it turns out that everyone else is eating, something else that is not what she has. And
Yes.
so I understand that. So maybe what I say, the truth is, you want to send your kid, if you're going to send a snack, with the most nourishing snack that they will accept. In my daughter's case, it happens to be sliced apples with lime on top.
Yeah.
That's what she likes, right? That's our compromise. I say the home can be a safe space for that introduction of the foods that are culturally relevant to whoever the adult or caregiver is. And really, adults and caregivers model the food culture, as you know, Jill, right? For whatever's going on in the home. So if we're telling our kids that tonight, like last night, I made nachos, right? And then I eat something different.
Yeah.
It's like we want to actually, when there are no allergies or sensitivities that are present, we want to actually have a family table, right? And family table can be auntie, uncle, neighbor, grandparent, but it's a table where we're all, coming together to eat those similar foods. And I think the home is a great place to, bring the culturally relevant foods to the forefront.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. So what if a family does not have a rich cultural food background? How can they begin to expose their children? I know with your cookbook, and we'll get to that next. But some suggestions for thinking about getting beyond the chicken nuggets and the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and embracing some of these cultural foods. And again, this probably depends on the region of the United States that you live in and your accessibility to these foods. But in general, what would be sort of some ways parents could think about doing that?
I love that question. And it's so interesting because when I think about like food across the United States, I actually think of like a very rich culinary history and chicken nuggets and the French fries and pizza and hamburgers. I think of more of a recent actual, addition to kind of US food patterns. Um, and I actually say, well, what are the ways, if that's what your family's eating, what are the ways that you can jazz that up? I've seen fascinating things that people do with like hamburgers, like, adding garlic, onions, flavor to the actual burger itself, playing with the bun. Not that we're at home baking bread anymore so much, but like starting with the things that you know as the base and then rounding it out with something else is very, I think, an interesting way. In my house, there are times where we'll have, chicken nuggets, or I'll do a combination of like chicken nuggets and plant-based nuggets. And then maybe I'll do like a really funky potato on the side. I did a show you black and white sesame potato the other day with a combination of plant-based and chicken nuggets. And that, like everyone was like, this is great. And so I do think sometimes you can clash foods that you don't always think go together on a plate as a way to expand the repertoire. I also think that you can explore your grocery store, your dollar store, your corner store for things that are not your norm, right? So let's say, like here in New York, we have access to tons and tons of stuff. Let's say we're interested in dumplings, right?
Yeah.
So then I go to Trader Joe's or I go to the, my local grocery store and I get like an assortment of dumplings. If there's a chicken, a pork, and a vegetable, because we eat everything in my house, I get all three. And then I serve all three together as a way to expand a flavor and see, what they like. I think trying new foods multiple times.
Yes.
And like I've taught my kids, it's so funny, like, to try things multiple times, like at least 10 before they totally write it off.
Yeah.
Can be helpful. And also trying it as a family, I think is a great way. Using herbs and spices, things like rice can be wonderfully spiced. Even thinking about changing what you're putting on top of your salad, using herbs and spices there. Jill, I remember the first time I went to Switzerland, that's where my husband's from. I fell in love with every single salad there because they were all so well seasoned. And I was like, this is incredible. We need to season our salads. They use fresh herbs. They use dried herbs, really interesting vinegars. And it's like, oh, of course, that's why everyone here is, really excited about eating their vegetables.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great. That's great. Those are really good tips. And then, of course, parents can start to cook some books or cook some recipes that are from different cultural heritages. So let's talk about eating from our roots.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that idea? How did you organize the book? And tell us, like I know it was hard to probably write. Maybe it wasn't. I think it's hard to write, but that's my bias speaking. But how did you come up with the idea? What motivated this cookbook for you? What were the big motivations? And tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah. So first, I have to totally validate what you said. 100%. It is hard to write. There are times where it is easy, like things just pour out of you. You get these spurts, and then there are times where you're just like, what, how, where? So yes, I want to validate that experience. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I originally thought with the book that I was going to travel around the world and go into the kitchens of like, aunts, uncles, grannies, grandpas, and like cook with them and then document the recipes. But that wasn't possible because we were in a shutdown portion of the pandemic. And so I actually worked with 7 chefs because I believe that chefs are the ultimate next to the, home cook in terms of taste and flavor. And I really wanted delicious recipes, right? I know that as dietitians, we're taught to like cut, reduce, remove.
Yeah.
And I really, right?
Yeah.
And I really wanted food. If I'm encouraging someone to go into the kitchen, I actually want them to return. I don't want them just to go in once and say, I gave that a try. The end result was just meh, right? Or the kids didn't eat it and they threw it out and you spent $40. Can you imagine? I was like, that's absolutely not what I want for families or for people. Because I'm really aware, right? It's a big deal to spend time and spend money on food preparation.
Yeah.
And so I worked with these chefs and, you know, we had a bunch of recipes. Some did not make it into the book. We modified some techniques to make it simple for the home cook. Everything was tested in my home kitchen with one of the chefs. So we had 7 chefs that were submitting, and then another chef that was in my home kitchen with me testing. And I like to remind people, like, I have a real home kitchen, right? So I have 5 burners. Yes, one more than the usual, but not 8 or 12.
Yeah.
I have an oven. I have a smaller oven. That's a speed oven that's but you know, you can't really do anything in there. So we were using my one oven and I have one sink. Right. So this is
a real life experiment.
Exactly. And with all of the, you know, the utensils in my kitchen, right? So like my knives, my pots, my pans. And that was a huge learning experience, right? To go through tasting all those recipes and traveling around the world and then seeing the similarities in terms of flavor profiles and the herbs and the spices. And saying like, oh my goodness, this like really reminds me of a dish from like Dominican Republic. And like, oh, wow, I didn't know that, you know, this was made here. And so it was a wonderful, wonderful experience in terms of expanding my culinary repertoire and techniques that I used. And also, Jill, in terms of my use of sugar, fat, and salt. Because
tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, you know, often in dietetics, we demonize those additives, right?
Yeah.
Of course, I always say, I'm not saying that I want people to wake up and eat, you know, a bag of Cheetos for breakfast every single day. So, you know, when I say that I'm food neutral, I am, but I also recognize in that we have to nourish our bodies and we want nutrient dense foods at the center of our pattern of eating the majority of the time. There's space for everything, but you still need nourishment, especially with kids.
Yeah.
Right? We're in this phase of growth and development with the pediatric population. And I, you know, oftentimes my instinct is no sugar, no fat, no salt, because that's how I've been trained. And remember, I work with a population where there's a clinical reason that they're coming to see me.
Yeah.
However, when used mindfully and intentionally, can be the most incredible enhancer.
Yeah.
Right. So, you know, sometimes starting a pan with a little bit of seasoning and then adding a dash of salt or like a sprinkle, you know, just playing with what you're using makes the food so much tastier. And if we're going for nourishment and you've sprinkled a little bit of salt on those veggies and a drizzle of a gorgeous finishing oil, right?
Or butter,
right? I mean, guess what? The food gets eaten.
That's how I raised my kids. I mean, and I'll tell you, my kids are in their 20s, and 20 years ago, I definitely felt like I was swimming upstream with this one. I was not broadcasting the fact that I was putting butter on vegetables and salting things or serving them whole milk or letting them have as much cheese as they want. Like a lot of times cheese was the snack. 20 years ago, that was definitely frowned upon. And I'm so happy that we're opening up to the benefits of flavor, because they do help, especially children, be willing to try different foods and enjoy eating those foods.
That's exactly right.
So in Eating from Our Roots, you've divided this book into breakfast recipes. You even have plant-based recipes, of course, dinner, things of that nature. What were there any particular cultural foods that you found yourself more drawn to, surprisingly, or had you already known which foods that, you enjoyed more? I don't know. I'm curious as to, what was surprising to you about some of the recipes in here?
So, I love them all, I have to say. And it's really funny. I always say to people, I'm like, I wonder if people can tell the ones that I developed. And no one will ever know. Or maybe I'll tell one day. So there were some recipes. There's a pork adobo recipe that was submitted by Chef Joel Javier, and it is incredible. It is amazing. It's like really amazing. But then there's also, some plant-based recipes that are also delicious. And then there's like some seasonings that are also delicious. There's a fried chicken recipe, Jill.
I've never made fried chicken.
Might be the best fried chicken I've ever had.
Is it easy to make?
No.
Okay. Because I am, and everybody who listens to this podcast knows, I am down for cooking, but it has got to be short list of ingredients and super easy. And that's really why I've never made fried chicken. It has nothing to do with me not liking fried chicken or having some, nutritional rules around fried chicken. None of that. It's just, that looks like a lot of mess.
Yeah. It is the hardest recipe in the book. It's really interesting. It is the hardest recipe in the book. And, I was giving a talk yesterday and I said, it's fascinating because there are a lot of these foods, right, that are like very kind of steeped in US culture that used to take all of this time to make. Yeah. Right. And also had all of this flavor. And I challenge people to say, like, you will not find another fried chicken that this is the best fried chicken, hands down. Like, hands down.
I'm gonna set a goal and make that a project. When I turn my book manuscript in, I'm gonna make that fried chicken.
And you have to have people over because it's so much work that you want to have a celebration. Like you want to have people witness what you've done.
Okay. All right. That sounds like a good challenge for sure. Where, Maya, can people get your book?
So people can find Eating from Our Roots everywhere that books are sold.
Okay. It's a beautiful book and a great size too. And I love all the pictures of your family in here, and that's sweet.
Thank you.
Awesome. Any parting words you have for folks listening to the show?
Yeah. I always like to remind people, especially parents, like, my goodness, you are doing the work. Give yourself some grace, especially when it comes to feeding your family and providing. Like, good is good enough. In fact, it's excellent.
Yay, that's such a great way to end. Thank you so much, Maya. We love having you here on the show, and best of luck or best regards with the promotion of this book. I hope many families go out and grab it.
Jill, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to your listeners.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.